If Donald Trump was allowed to federalize California's National Guard and also to send Marines to Los Angeles, California, given that California has state rights, why wouldn't he be allowed to federalize the National Guard in Washington, D.C.? Now, the federal Congress itself is controlled by MAGA, so why wouldn't they affirm his capability to do so? Now, the federal Democrats, the establishment itself, will tell us what they continue to tell us, which is that it is a distraction, right? They will just utilize litigation, which ultimately, if California hasn't been able to remove that authority from him, why wouldn't, he have authority over territory that isn't even a state? What we're experiencing is an ongoing constitutional coup, which is the executive who is utilizing the shortcoming of the Constitution, so the lack of guardrails in order to say, since it's not forbidden, then I'm allowed, right? And ultimately the courts will say, well, technically you're right, right? I don't like it, but technically you're right. There's no guardrails to this, right? And now reality, the states will be required to adapt to an authoritarian rule just because the courts have been corrupt, just because the Congress itself was maximized through the MAGA control, right? In this reality, we have to ask ourselves, are we going to be obedient to a rogue unconstitutional government that is promoting laws that are contrary to that of the guarantees promoted within the social contract that each state ratified? The fact that he wants to forcibly remove the homeless population in Washington, D.C., which is contrary to the constitutional actual right to be capable of moving freely across the states, right? So the fact that you don't like a certain population doesn't mean that you can just kick them out. But we also have to acknowledge that this is a strategy that has been utilized by red states, right? You give homeless people a ticket to the blue states, and then we're stuck with them. Like California, a good amount of the homeless people in California aren't even from California, they're from other states. So in this reality, they're removing Americans from that location and relocating them to other places. That is forced displacement, right? He wants to fortify Washington, D.C. in order to say to restore the safety of the territory, right? But in reality, what he's doing is fortifying his own sort of loyalist compound, right? When we think of Pyongyang in North Korea, somewhere where the loyalist is concentrated and he is safe away from retaliation, right? In this reality, we have to understand that if anyone is going to resist today, if it is called, it has to be the people. It has to be the people within Washington, D.C. It has to be the people surrounding Washington, D.C. actually showing up. Because what we learned from California, from like Bell, California, all of these, is that when the people show up in numbers, they drive these agencies and these rogue actors away. But if we just depend on the elected officials to do something and save us, that's not going to happen, right? Because technically, are they allowed to do it? I mean, they're the federal government, right? Who gets to dictate when the contract is void? The fact that he has continuously been breaching the contract, yet there hasn't been any actual remedy to that formats because litigation is so slow. How do you trigger the litigation? You act first and litigate later. That's what Republicans be doing. That's what Democrats are just starting to say that we're going to do, right? But ultimately, we have to acknowledge that within this reality, I believe that unfortunately it's going to be successful. And while there's going to be people who resist, I think in the majority there's going to be people who will recognize that if they resist such a reality, then they may be harmed. They may be put to jail, right? But the reality is that there's better to have an end to terror than a terror without end, right? But ultimately, people tend to default the responsibility of doing anything to other people because, of course, other people are going to do it, not me, right? But it starts within you. And it starts within the people within Washington, D.C. to say, we're not going to stand for this. But then again, obviously, that's where it's concentrated, obviously, because he's there. So there is going to be an increase in militarization. So what do you do in that reality? But in that reality, the fact that the United States of America is being militarized, what this means is that he can easily federalize the National Guard in every single state, right? It is a show of force. And I think there's a 50% chance that he's going to do it. There is a 50% chance that it's just saying, I'm capable of hurting you if I want to, so maybe settle down and stop trying to resist me because ultimately I can invoke whatever I want to. Even if I don't call it martial law, I can do it anyways, right? He's trying to tell us to not resist because ultimately we will get harmed. We're going to get harmed anyways, but it's a way to maintain fear so we're not resisting, so we're not out there, marching, so we're not out there protesting. but there's also a 50% chance that he's actually going to do it, because why wouldn't he? He has majority Congress, he has the executive agencies at the palm of his hand, he has local and state enforcement throughout, even in California, right? Because our governor Gavin Newsom hasn't utilized emergency powers in order to get that power back. He has the military, because for every soldier who's unwilling to commit, unconstitutional acts, there are military members who will, as long as they get, guarantees from the government that they won't face any, prosecution after. So ultimately, there's going to be Americans who will believe that an obedience to the Constitution is an obedience to a tyrant, to the government, when in fact it is to the social contract, right? But ultimately, a lot of Americans think that the contract is only as binding as a court says that it is, and that's untrue. However, in this reality, we must acknowledge that we're in a very decisive moment. And ultimately, while I don't think that there's going to be sufficient resistance today in order to defend democracy on this level, I do hope that I do see resistance, because ultimately what has happened is that whenever there is harm against a certain, group, what the response is, it's a distraction, right? First they came for immigrants, it's a distraction. First they came for US citizens, it's a distraction. Can't harass US citizens, but they can detain US citizens, which means that you can go into the detention centers. Innocent until proven guilty. You're guilty until being proven a US citizen, right? But that's a distraction, right? Transgender Americans, distraction, right? This, what's happening, right? They're going to tell us that it's a distraction, but actually the harm is going to be real. This is the consolidation of power. And no matter how people continue to say it's a distraction, these are actual harm avenues that are being strategized in order to consolidate power. And if we allow for this to happen without any actual response, primarily from the blue states, and retaliation against the federal government for what they're doing, then we're going to slowly but surely collapse and lose our liberties, lose our freedom, and there's going to be a question of what are we willing to give up in order to maintain that liberty and freedom, and that's going to involve either one, going through an anarchy route of the people, mobilizing against an unconstitutional government, or that is a state government actually leading on that avenue, right? That is preferred because it's much more legitimate. So ultimately, that's why I tell us that we have to force the blue state governments to actually maximize on those powers, right? Because the only way to leverage against the federal government in order to act a certain way is to put pressure on them. That includes ending federal funding. That includes, criminalizing ICE agents, criminalizing the federal government on constitutional campaigns. Because, for instance, what if the administration says that I'm promoting, some type of thing that is, against the law, right? And what I'm positioning. And then they try to come and get me. Who will protect me? Will it be my governor Gavin Newsom, because he hasn't done that when it comes to immigration, with U.S. citizens being, detained and kidnapped? So in this reality, there's a question of how willing our state governments are in protecting us. And it's complicated, because while my governor Gavin Newsom is doing much better, he doesn't really act when it comes to immigration, because it's perceived that the federal is above the state. But that can be said in all realities, except the fact that we're in a crisis means that the state is much more capable of advancing and maximizing an offense against the federal government. But that is against decorum, that is against tradition. Now, tradition itself isn't going to save us, litigation isn't going to save us, because litigation only remedies once the harm is already done. We need proactive, preventative measures to ensure that we don't get to the maximum, and that involves willingness from the state legislature and primarily the emergency powers of a governor. And ultimately, that's the only avenues, I think, in which we are capable of exhausting the channel, so that we can fully be capable of maximizing on our strategies to go against unconstitutional government, right? Including the creation of a militia in the state in order to defend the state from any sort of, abuses and wrongdoings against bad actors, including the federal government.